Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on immigration and the 2024 election. My name is Llana Barber, and I'm the director of the Immigration History Research Center at the University of Minnesota. The Immigration History Research Center, IHRC, aims to transform the way we understand immigration in the past and the present. We believe that we can use lessons from our history to inform our current national immigration conversation. A bit of housekeeping. This webinar is being recorded. The question and answer portion will happen in the Q&A function of Zoom. You can submit questions at any time during the presentation, and we'll turn to audience questions at the end of the program. You can choose to submit questions anonymously if you don't want your name to be mentioned when the question is posted. I want to acknowledge that the University of Minnesota's Twin Cities campus is located on Dakota land. Today, many Indigenous people, including Dakota and Ojibwe, call the Twin Cities home. I'll introduce all of our speakers now at the beginning of our program. Before we begin, David Bier is the Director of Immigration Studies at the Cato Institute. He's an expert on legal immigration, border security, and interior enforcement. Bier's work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, USA Today, and many other print and online publications. The US Supreme Court and multiple federal appeals courts have cited his research and writing. Bier has testified before House and Senate committees on several occasions. From 2013 to 2025, Bier drafted immigration legislation as a senior policy advisor for Representative Raul Labrador. Then a member and later the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee's Subcommittee on Immigration and Border Security. Yale Schacher is Director for the Americas and Europe at Refugees International, an independent research and advocacy organization in Washington, D.C. Yale is a historian of immigration law and policy and is completing a book on the history of asylum in the United States. Her work at Refugees International focuses on migration pathways for displaced people and the relationship between immigration policy and foreign policy. Before joining Refugees International, Yale taught immigration history and literature, was a postdoctoral fellow at the Institute for Historical Studies at the University of Texas at Austin, and received a PhD in American Studies from Harvard University. Julia Decker currently serves as Policy Director for the Immigrant Law Center of Minnesota. She previously served as Policy Director at the ACLU of Minnesota, and she was a teaching fellow at the University of Minnesota Law School's Binger Center for New Americans. She's a 2014 graduate of the University of Minnesota Law School. Debbie Kang is Associate Professor of History in the Corcoran Department of History, and John L. Now III Associate Professor of the History and Principles of Democracy at the Karsh Institute of Democracy at the University of Virginia. Her first book, The INS of the Line, Making Immigration Law on the US-Mexico Border from 1917 to 1954, traces the history of US immigration agencies on the US-Mexico border and earned several awards, including the Henry Adams Prize from the Society for History in the federal government, the Theodore Saludos Book Award from the Immigration Ethnic History Society, the Berkshire Conference of Women Historians Book Prize, the W. Turrentine Jackson Award from the Western History Association, and the Americo Paredes Book Award for the best nonfiction book on Chicano, Chicana, Mexican-American, and/or Latino-Latina studies. She is currently preparing law review articles on the criminalization of undocumented immigration, and with Danielle Battisti has co-edited a forthcoming volume, Hidden Histories of Unauthorized Migrations from Europe to the United States, which is forthcoming from University of Illinois Press in 2025. So I'm so grateful to all of our panelists for joining us today. I think we're going to have a wonderful conversation. First up, we have David Bier. Thank you all.
Thanks for hosting this event, and I really appreciate the opportunity to outline what I see as sort of the major changes or prospects for immigration in a new administration in 2025. So I think starting with a potential Trump administration is easier because I see a lot of continuity between the Biden administration and potential Harris administration. We know a lot of the plans that a Trump administration would seek to roll out because they've already attempted to implement them during their prior administration. And I think they'll have even more success in implementing many of their policies this time around. Just to take probably the most prominent example is the travel ban that was imposed for security reasons against mainly majority Muslim countries, but then was later expanded to parts of Africa and Asia. I expect that ban to be even larger, as President Trump himself has said he wants a larger ban, already specifically called out Palestinian travelers to the United States and immigrants as being a group that he would exclude. I would expect to see it also be applied to Venezuelans and potentially even many Chinese immigrants and travelers to this country, based on comments that have been made by his former advisors about those populations and their inability to vet them and so forth. So a lot of the same justifications that we saw the last time around. Ultimately, 12 countries ended up being on the banned list. And I expect that this time around, you're going to see many more countries be added to it, in part because the Supreme Court greenlit any kind of restrictions that the president might want to impose. And COVID ultimately showed how easy it was to implement those types of restrictions. He's also said that he's going to suspend the refugee program. This is something we saw the last time around. The refugee admissions numbers during his term in office were reduced by 90%. And that is, you can't blame that on the pandemic. That was an intentional policy pursued by the prior administration to reduce those numbers. And cuts would be even more dramatic this time around, even if it doesn't go to zero, even if it's, to the same level it was last time, just because the numbers that are coming in right now are higher than they were in 2016, the last time he came into office. Looking more broadly at legal immigration policy, his administration attempted to impose the public charge rule for immigrants, primarily focused on family-sponsored immigration. That policy never really took hold because of COVID. It came into effect just before the pandemic shut down immigrant visa process. We didn't really get to see the full effects of it. But the main point of that policy was to exclude low-skill, lower-income immigrants from immigrating, creating a presumption of ineligibility to immigrate if you were a lower-income immigrant. And so that is a policy ready-made to be rolled out. It would require regulation, so it wouldn't be something that could happen on day one, but it would certainly be something that we would see within the first year being rolled out again. He's restricted every type of visa category, so I won't go into all of them. I just note that even at the high-skilled end of things, he imposed an enormous number of restrictions on H-1B visas and increased denials dramatically for that category, restricted eligibility, and it imposed new requirements that would reduce the size of that program and ultimately reduce the population of existing H-1B holders in the United States. I think the general principle that we see both in the prior administration's actions as well as some of the stuff that's coming out from his advisors in Project 2025 is slow down immigration by any means necessary. He talked about extreme vetting. I just call that extremely bureaucratic vetting, and just imposing paperwork requirements. We saw denials based on the blank space policy. You had to fill in anything, even if it wasn't applicable to you. We're going to see many, many instances like that requiring repeated fingerprinting of people already previously fingerprinted, even if they're already in the United States. These types of actions just to make things more expensive, slow things down, and create problems for people coming. And then, of course, you look at the legal migration channels that that the Biden administration has created through the use of parole. So we have parole sponsorship for 4 countries plus Ukraine. And those parole sponsorship programs, Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Ukraine, are letting in about 30 to 35,000 individuals per month. So it's a very significant portion of legal migration to the United States. And he has promised to eliminate those programs on day one, which potentially would be within his authority to do that. And so you're scratching a major portion of legal migration that's been channeling people away from illegal migration to the border. And along with that, he's talked about the fact that the asylum ban that the Biden administration imposed this year doesn't go far enough. And principally there, the main exception is for people entering legally at Southwest ports of entry, where they have scheduled an appointment using the CBP1 app. So that process would be eliminated under a Trump administration, which again would force people to have a choice between going home and crossing the border illegally, trying to smuggle your way in, essentially, into the United States, assuming a travel ban were in effect. He is specifically, and his the Republican Party platform singles out unaccompanied children, the unaccompanied children program at the border, which essentially prevents the immediate deportation of unaccompanied children who are encountered by Border Patrol, requires them to be turned over to the Office of Refugee Resettlement for processing and placement with sponsors in the United States. That program is essentially said to be eliminated using Title 42 authority, which is a health code law. It's hard to see exactly what they plan to do there, but the goal would be we're going to expel the kids as opposed to place them with sponsors in the United States. So when it comes to border processing, asylum, the goal is to eliminate any possible way for refugees, humanitarian immigrants to have a lawful way to enter the country or to get into a process to get legal status if they cross the border illegally. And that brings us to the interior enforcement policy that this potential Trump administration has been proposing and outlining in various forums. And what I see essentially there is they understand that last time they really failed to accomplish their objective, which was mass deportation. It was always the goal of the prior administration. The border issues kind of gummed up some of it, but the big issue is the resources within immigration and customs enforcement to carry out a major operation like they're proposing in the millions of people, even tens of millions of people that they're talking about rounding up and removing from the United States, cannot be done within the existing resources and personnel available to immigration and customs enforcement. Not enough detention facilities, not enough agents to go after everyone. So how they handle that and how the courts handle their efforts to get around those resources constraints are kind of the big unknown. But the thing that we can be sure of is that they will get rid of all of the prioritization memos and limits that have been placed on ICE by the Biden administration. So right now we have a prioritization memo that requires immigration and customs enforcement agents to focus solely on recent border crossers and national security and public safety threats. And that would be immediately scrapped as it was in 2017, which would open up the possibility to target anyone for removal the most immediate effect of getting rid of the prioritization memos would mean that people going through the immigration court process could not seek to have their case dismissed based on the prioritization memo, which has been a huge benefit to the immigration courts and in deprioritizing and setting aside those particular lower priority cases so they can focus on some of these higher priority public safety threats that the administration is seeking to remove from the country. And so I think interior enforcement, they're looking to use the military to enforce immigration law. Most people believe that there is legal issues, to put it mildly, with this approach. Whether they care, I don't think they do. They're going to go forward with their plans to use military bases and military personnel to make arrests, to use military bases as detention facilities. That is what they're planning to do. And I think they have a lot of targets that they're going to focus on: people in immigrant shelters in New York and Boston. These are places where, okay, we can pull these people off the streets. We kind of know that there's an opportunity to do that and move them into Department of Defense detention facilities. And whether the courts have some backbone and are willing to stand up for this, allow this to go forward, is certainly the biggest question that I have going into a potential Trump administration. In terms of the Harris administration, just very quickly, I think the Parole in Place program, which is essentially the program that was announced this year to allow certain spouses and minor children of U.S. citizens to adjust their status through the use of parole, that would essentially clean the slate so they could adjust status based on their relationship to a U.S. citizen. This would benefit hundreds of thousands of individuals who have married U.S. citizens in the United States. This is held up in the courts. If a Trump administration came in, they would eliminate it. It potentially could go forward. I think there's a strong legal case behind that program. So this is something that potentially the courts and even the Supreme Court would uphold in the end, but it would be a long process, and it would likely extend into a potential Harris administration. I think there are other opportunities to expand the use of parole to other nationalities and streamline some of those procedures in order to provide alternatives to illegal immigration under a Harris administration. Otherwise, I think there's a lot of continuity. She's leaned into the enforcement side, the asylum ban that was rolled out this year that eliminates the opportunity to apply for asylum for most individuals who cross the border illegally. I think she's committed to that. But other aspects of immigration policy, I expect to be quite similar to what we see under the Biden administration. So I look forward to the conversation and any questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much to David Bier. Next, we have Yale Schacher.
Thanks so much. Great to go after David because that was super clear and comprehensive. I hope I don't make it super complicated now because I'm gonna jump into like a little bit more, given sort of my area of focus on the refugee and asylum related policies that sort of the changes that have happened during the current administration, what I could see happening moving forward, and sort of what's at stake in the election on refugee and asylum policy, picking up on some of the things that David said about those issues. And again, thanks again to the University of Minnesota for having me at this exciting panel on the day of the debate, no less. So I guess I just want to level set for a second and just explain to the audience, just to make sure we're all on the same page, that like there's two ways of you can become a refugee. which is defined in US and international law as a person who has a fear that if they're returned to their home country, they would be persecuted based on their race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. The two ways are you can be screened overseas and resettled through the US refugee admissions program, or you can come to the US and seek asylum and be screened by an asylum officer and immigration judge. So in April 2021, I remember I did a podcast with WOLA, the Washington office in Latin America here. This is the beginning of the Biden administration. I pointed out that the United States refugee admissions program had never resettled people from Latin America in any large numbers whatsoever. If you look at the historical regional breakdown since the advent of the resettlement program in 1980, Latin America has the tiniest percentage of people, never more than a few thousand, of an average of like 80,000 per year that have been resettled in the program historically for the past 44 years. It obviously went down dramatically during the Trump administration and has been built up again now, as David was pointing out. And the Biden administration has done a significant number of things to sort of rebuild the refugee resettlement program. And one of the more remarkable things that it has done is that it has resettled it will have resettled in FY 2024 about 25,000 of about 100,000 refugees from Latin America and the Caribbean. So people coming from our Americas, which is comparable to the regional numbers that are like, for Africa and for the Near East, South Asia, which is, basically the Middle East. So all indications are that Harris would continue the process and make more innovations, probably. Some of the reasons why some of the problems we have with resettling people, why people can't be resettled, have to do with documentary requirements and the refusal of certain third countries to allow for the processing of refugees. The way refugee resettlement works is that you flee your home country typically and you're in a third country. So Afghans go to Pakistan and they're in Pakistan and they have to be screened and processed for refugee resettlement in the United States there. And that can be tricky depending on, what the Pakistani government wants to allow the United States to do in terms of processing and what kind of documents Afghans have come out. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. And I think, the big question for incoming Harris administration is, if you really were committed to sort of making the resettlement program even bigger than it now is, because as David sort of hinted, and as I'll talk about more, the Harris administration is likely, as the Biden administration did, to really lean into this idea that to receive refugee status in the United States, you have to come the right way. You cannot cross between a port of entry and just come here on your own and just decide how you want to get here and seek refugee status that way. We'd rather vet you overseas in various innovative ways that we'll try, and we'll even do that in Latin America in unprecedented ways, or you have to come to a port of entry and use this app that David described if you want to seek asylum. But they're really leaning into that. But how much are they willing to do to actually build up the ability of people, to resettle more people from overseas? That would require significant diplomatic investment. So generally, if you think about what the U.S. does foreign policy-wise on this, the U.S. tends to lean into sanctions, atrocity determinations, trafficking reports. It doesn't do as much diplomatically to create pathways for survivors of all of those things. It tends to use its aid dollars to sort of make its aid money contingent on actually countries deterring out migration. That's especially true in the Western Hemisphere and Latin America and Central America. Actually, aid packages will be contingent on, countries making significant efforts to stop people from leaving their countries. And what we probably would need to do to really make resettlement bigger the U.S. would have to actually make a commitment to changing this kind of diplomacy and really leaning in to using diplomacy to push for increased processing for resettlement, to make that a diplomatic priority. There are, millions and millions of displaced people in the world who meet the refugee definition. I just want to make that clear. The U.S. refugee resettlement program, which I said, typically resettles 80,000 people a year. This year, we're going to go up to 100,000. Obviously chooses certain people to give access to the program and to screen for resettlement based on factors that go way beyond meeting the refugee definition, which again, many more people can meet than we're actually screening, right, overseas. What are some of those factors? Whether or not people are especially humanitarian concern to the United States. Historically, that means they've been US military allies or another geopolitical reason why we give them preference for refugee resettlement or access to the refugee resettlement program. They have family ties in the United States, or hoping that it will help the US manage migration without driving irregular migration. So what I mean by that is that, again, the US might ask, many countries, like take Colombia and Latin America, for example, there have been 3 million Venezuelans who have come to Colombia. The US is going to take a few of those through its refugee resettlement program. And the idea sort of is, certainly Colombia doesn't want the US refugee resettlement program set up in Colombia to draw more Venezuelans as a sort of pull factor into Colombia to seek a pathway to the United States. So it has to set it up so it's not seen as a pull factor by Colombia, but also seen by the Colombian government as sort of like a thank you that the US is taking a couple of people off their hands, and sort of an incentive for Colombia to keep its doors open to Venezuelans and continue to provide Venezuelans with refuge. So it's complicated how this actually works diplomatically. I just wanted to point out some of the things that actually drive our resettlement program. And there are other things that sort of blur why the US gives people refuge. Afghans were actually paroled into the United States rather than being processed as refugees when they were evacuated. And obviously, as David pointed out, the Biden administration is using the parole power for these parole pathways to be able to better manage migration at a huge scale, much larger scale than refugee resettlement allows, right? The pathways for the parole pathways are quite large. And the CBP-1 pathway that is used to actually give people access to asylum at the southern border, like you have to come to a port of entry using that. The thing about CBP-1, though, is it's not protection sensitive. So anybody can apply for a CBP-1 appointment. And it doesn't prioritize people who actually need to seek asylum, and it's not tied to the merits of claim. So basically, it's giving access to asylum, making access to asylum contingent not on the merits of the claims or the need for protection, but on how you actually enter the country. And that I think has muddied the waters. I don't think Americans really understand or have been asked, or really we're approaching this debate about maybe Americans don't even know who is legally considered a refugee and who should get a chance to be assessed for refugee status. Because we have muddied the waters at this point. One other thing I wanted to mention about the refugee resettlement program, before just switching a little bit into the asylum ban and a couple of things about asylum, is that one of the things that I've heard from some folks in the Biden administration about the refugee resettlement program. I mean, as David said, if in the next Trump administration, all of the innovations around the refugee resettlement program could potentially just disappear, given that they would just lower the number of people to be resettled. One of the things the Biden administration and maybe potential Harris administration is hoping for is that some of the innovations they put in place, in particular the private sponsorship program, which basically has given Americans the ability to basically, it's called the Welcome Corps, to basically form a group of people in a community and then request that a particular refugee that they know or that they're aware of overseas could be given access to the refugee resettlement program and screen. This is called sort of a private refugee component to the resettlement system. About 100,000 Americans have actually signed up to do this, to sponsor refugees. And what I think the Biden administration / coming Harris administration hopes is that if the Trump administration slashes the entire refugee admissions program maybe takes the presidential determination of how many refugees can be resettled down to like very close to zero, some of these people will push back, especially the people who have, come forward and said, we really support the refugee resettlement program, to the point that we actually want to financially support people once they come and once they arrive. We want to privately sponsor these folks. They see it as a way of sort of bulletproofing the refugee resettlement program. I'm somewhat skeptical of that. I mean, if the Trump administration reduces the PD to zero, there's not that much people can do, but it is an interesting approach. It's the idea of raising public awareness and public involvement and public sort of engagement in a way, and commitment to the program, regardless of who's president, who's in the executive, who holds the presidential office. This is a sort of interesting thing, this private resettlement program as a sort of bulletproofing. As David mentioned, the Trump-Vance campaign doesn't want the refugee admissions program at all. Will probably dismantle it in total, might let some European refugees in. That's what they did the first time around. They really talk about resettlement as if it's like something appalling, something we should be shocked by, even though it's like this old thing that's existed for many, many years. And of course, they don't want to deal with asylum seekers at the border in the slightest. The Biden administration has unfortunately not revoked some of the rules that the Trump administration put in place during its administration on asylum, which is a problem because they will actually still technically be in place in a second Trump administration. These include rules on the asylum cooperative agreements with the Central American governments, which basically allows the United States to send asylum seekers who come to the border to other countries to have them processed there. The Biden administration had promised when it came into office to finalize a regulation that actually defined what it meant and who would be eligible for someone being persecuted based on a particular social group ground. This usually typically applies to people who are victims of gang or domestic violence. And the Biden administration has not yet finalized that rule. I think a lot of people in the advocacy community are hoping that he will finalize it, the administration will finalize it before they leave office, but it's not in place now. And there are other things that the Biden administration has not reversed, certain decisions by the Department of Justice about who's eligible for asylum that are still in place, even though the Justice Department promised to sort of take another look at some of those. They're important. It has to do with people coming from countries where they might have been coerced into engaging in behavior that would make them barred from asylum, whether or not that matters if they were coerced. I mean, these are really, really important things that really affect asylum seekers. The Harris and Wallace administration doesn't really talk publicly about the refugee resettlement program very much at all. What they do talk about is securing the border. As David said, they're leaning into this enforcement idea. Harris usually focuses, when she talks about securing the border, on her, background as a prosecutor, cracking down on transnational criminal gangs and traffickers. But the current policy in place and the legislation that Harris says she supports bars from asylum eligibility those who cross the border without authorization in between ports of entry. So anybody who does cross the border and claims fear of persecution in their home country is currently put through this rapid screening process while in detention, and they aren't actually eligible for asylum. I actually feel like the campaign is not focusing at all on the issue of asylum and what are the actual policy questions about asylum that are at stake and that the Harris administration should consider. So, for example, questions we're not asking the American public about, or we're not talking about when we talk about asylum reform, is, do you support letting people who cross the border without permission be considered for asylum? If you don't, do you think there should be a way to expand the way people can seek asylum at ports of entry? And I'm working on a report right now about how historically, since 1980, when we created the asylum system, the U.S. policy has discouraged the use of ports by asylum seekers. So actually doing that, making ports more available to asylum seekers, would be as big a shift as rebuilding the refugee admissions program in innovative ways. That's a discussion we probably should have. Is there something beyond CBP1 or ways that CBP1 should use that would be more protected and sensitive or whatever that would make ports of entry more accessible? We're not actually having that conversation. Should there be a quota on how many people should be eligible for asylum each year? That's sort of implied in a lot of the policy discussion now and the policies that Harris is supporting, but we're not making that an explicit question. And then, after people seek asylum, what kind of procedure should they be put through? Should they be detained? Should they have to fill out an application in English if they don't speak English? These are the real asylum policy questions that are at stake that we're not having right now. Thanks.
Thanks so much to Yael Schacher. Next up, we have Julia Decker.
Thank you so much. Really glad to be here, and thank you to the IHRC for inviting me to speak today. I want to take maybe a slightly different approach to these very important topics that we're all sort of discussing here right now, and focus a little bit more on the way that we as the general public are being talked at about this subject, because we hear about immigration in the news, on social media. It's a hot topic for politicians and for pollsters, and certainly many folks are thinking about it with the election on the horizon. So sort of stepping back, and some of this may be very much review for folks, but just as sort of to re-emphasize amidst sort of the many messaging talking points we hear, a few things to understand about immigration law and policy. First and foremost, immigration law itself is federal law. So when we're talking about changes that need to happen, those have to be done in Congress, and that's why federal elections matter. Immigration law is predominantly not criminal law. Immigration proceedings, when you hear people talk about going to immigration courts, those are not criminal courts, or indeed courts that we as sort of the general public typically think of them as. They are civil administrative proceedings. And this also includes detention. So when you hear people talk about immigration detention, that is also civil detention, not criminal, even if the people are being held in detention facilities that may also house folks who are either awaiting trial on a criminal charge or have in fact been convicted of criminal charges. The ICE detainees are civil detainees. State laws, as I mentioned, state laws can't change immigration laws themselves, but they can still, of course, impact immigrants, documented and undocumented in many ways. And that's why state elections matter. We typically, I think, hear about immigration in sort of the state and local sphere around things like public safety, but important to think about things like healthcare and education, and even down to day-to-day things like auto insurance and access to utilities, electricity, lights. Those can intersect with folks' lives day to day. They are often the subject of state laws and policies. So for instance, Minnesota, as many of you may be aware, passed policies in the last legislative biennium to allow driver's licenses to be applied for regardless of immigration status, expanding healthcare to folks who may not have immigration status, expanding access to things like utilities and rentals with an individual tax identification number in place of a social security number. At the same time, we have certainly seen other states make those things harder or, increase prohibitions on what non-citizens may be able to do. So there's this balancing between, how states are trying to impact immigrants within their borders. I think it's also important to consider that state laws, even if they are not explicitly mentioning immigration or are indeed not explicitly targeting immigration or immigrants or refugee populations, can still have ramifications. So considering things like policing, things like surveillance technology, which of course impact everybody's rights, but also can have potentially unique and even more detrimental impacts for people who do not have immigration status, or even people who do have immigration status but are not citizens. Another thing to be, I think, aware of as we hear all this noise and this rhetoric about immigration is that the language of discussions around immigration simply can't do justice to the complexity and nuance of even the sort of varying degrees of immigration statuses that people may have. we hear these binary terms or distinctions that are drawn: illegal versus legal, documented versus undocumented, when the reality is there's more of a spectrum that is not really reflected in those distinctions. And for example, a person who enters the United States without permission could file paperwork, and of course this is the subject of the programs that panelists previously referred to, could potentially file paperwork to become a lawful permanent resident if they marry a United States citizen. So at the time that they entered, they would not have any documentation. At the time that they file paperwork, they are then in process to potentially attain some sort of immigration status, but they still aren't fully documented until they receive, they achieve that endpoint of that process. And so there's some nuance there. Of course, we are all very familiar, I think, with things like DACA, deferred action, temporary protected status, these types of programs that allow people to gain work authorization, but don't in and of themselves have a pathway to a more permanent immigration status. And so those folks remain in a sort of limbo somewhere in between, where we would maybe consider them documented to some extent, but not fully able to be a lawful permanent resident. And I think, something that sometimes gets lost amidst, again, all the noise is that immigrants and refugees, documented, undocumented, many of these folks are our neighbors, they're our community members, they're our coworkers, they're our colleagues. And there is this tendency, I think, in a lot of conversations to sort of other immigrants, make them a sort of out group and think of or talk about the immigrant experience as sort of a binary, immigrants versus citizens, when the reality is, like immigration status is, there's not a binary distinction. Immigrants and refugees are diverse in their experiences and opinions and ideas, and they are as diverse as any other group of people. And I think also recognizing that right now, like right in this moment, there are people in Minnesota detention facilities under ICE detention, and there are families that are experiencing the impacts of the immigration system right now, today, in our state, within our state borders. And sort of the flip side, I guess, of that point is that we talk a lot about how this immigration system impacts non-citizens, but as I mentioned, this is federal law. This is the federal government exercising power over a particular group of people. And I think we, as, whatever sort of status we have, if we're permanent residents, if we're citizens, there are ramifications for us, even as citizens, that come out of how the government exercises its power over a group that it deems as sort of an out group, as sort of an other. I think sort of a demonstration of this is in immigration court, which I practiced in for a number of years before I moved to policy. In these immigration proceedings, the Fourth Amendment around unreasonable search and seizure really doesn't mean that much. And, that may be sort of, people might say, well, that's a different situation. It doesn't really apply to me because I'm a US citizen. But I think it's important to think about how, if the government has the ability to use that power against people in that situation who often they don't automatically get a lawyer, they don't have necessarily the same constitutional protections in that court, what does that say about what the government's capability is to exercise its power over other people? And finally, I would just say, I think as within this rhetoric and these narratives, there is no one solution. There's no magic, wand to wave that will take care of the many facets of the problems in the immigration systems: visa backlogs, high filing fees, inefficient or ineffective processes at the border, access to legal services. There is no one set way or one set policy that will make all of those things suddenly work. And so that is how I would just urge people to think about all the messaging and the sort of sound bites, and how to be able to think beyond those sound bites.
Thanks so much to Julia Decker. Next, we have Debbie Kang.
Hi, everyone. Just give me a second to share my screen. So thank you to everyone for being here this afternoon. It's an honor for me to be in conversation with this esteemed group of panelists and everyone in the audience. So when I was asked to join this panel, I was asked to provide some historical context, a historical overview of this current election season and the way it's engaging with the issue of immigration and immigration law and policy. And I was also asked to think about the similarities between then and now. And so I'll attempt to do that in the next few minutes, but because I only have 10 minutes, there's no way I'm going to be comprehensive. So these are just a few of my thoughts. So I often tell my students that immigration history is a subfield of US history in which history seems to repeat itself. For me, this election season has only underscored this point as both Democrats and Republicans have drawn upon anti-immigrant playbooks that have been around for centuries. In the next few minutes, I'll supply a few examples of how policymakers have revived old xenophobic tropes and green-lighted restrictionist laws and policies. I'll then close with some brief thoughts on the implications of our nation's immigration history for our democracy and immigrants themselves. Now, first and perhaps most prominently, the GOP, as many of you know, has worked very hard to spread misinformation about immigrants, or noise, as Julia appropriately called it. As an August 2024 Washington Post article, for example, discovered, GOP campaign ads that had been broadcast on TV between January and June of this year often spread misinformation about immigrants and the border. And the Washington Post specifically concluded that taken as a whole, the ads convey an unrealistic portrait of the border as being overrun and inaccurately characterize immigrants generally as a threat, of which there is little evidence. Yet, as immigration historians know, and as the students in the room may have learned in their classes, the dissemination of lies and negative stereotypes about immigrants has long been a feature of US immigration history. Thus, for example, in the 19th century, anti-immigrant politicians drew upon the racist rhetoric that had been applied to African-American slaves and indigenous persons to dehumanize the Irish and later the Chinese. The derisive ideas and arguments applied to the Irish and the Chinese then sort of congealed and came to constitute what historian Natalia Molina has called a racial script, and what sociologist Leo Chavez has referred to as the Latino threat narrative, or what I'll call the immigrant threat narrative. So with these racial scripts circulating in the zeitgeist, future politicians and policymakers could deploy these racial scripts and immigrant threat narratives to advance their own anti-immigrant agendas from the 19th century to the present. So to put it differently, the work of these migration scholars has demonstrated that these immigrant threat narratives and that these racial scripts aren't exceptional in any way. We actually shouldn't be surprised by them, but instead we should recognize, we should be aware that these immigrant threat narratives, these racial scripts now constitute an integral component of our history. And they're just as integral as this notion, and some call it this myth, of America as a nation of immigrants. Now, in the run-up to the election, we saw Democratic candidates, and this has been mentioned by Yael and David, we've seen Democratic candidates, first Biden and then Harris, leaning into an enforcement-minded stand on immigration and especially asylum policy. And in some ways, their stands echoed conservative talking points, again, especially on asylum. Now, while some may have been surprised by their rhetoric, history teaches us that bipartisan efforts to bolster the nation's immigration and border enforcement capacities isn't new. So, for example, by the late 1800s, both the Republican and Democratic parties drafted party platforms that supported Chinese exclusion, and both parties did so because they needed the votes of Californians who were at the vanguard of the movement to ban Chinese immigrants from the United States. More broadly, from the nation's founding to the present, politicians have known that xenophobia wins votes. As a result, history reveals that our nation's immigration enforcement architecture is very much a bipartisan creation. So if we move forward to an example from more recent history, historians such as Sarah Coleman and Joseph Nevins have explained to us that we owe the expansion of the Border Patrol, the construction of the border wall, and the proliferation of immigration prisons to both Democrats and Republicans who passed some of the most draconian immigration laws in US history in the 1980s and 1990s. I should also say that there now is a plethora of books on this topic, on the bipartisan contributions to immigration law enforcement. And if you want a longer list, send me an email and I'd be happy to send you that longer list. So as in the Chinese exclusion era of the late 19th century, Democrats and Republicans in the late 20th century recognized that xenophobia, that anti-immigrant platforms won votes. The third lesson from history is that harm, or what sociologists Cecilia Menjivar and Lacy Abrego refer to as legal violence, right? Harm and legal violence have been endemic to our nation's immigration system. Indeed, by the late 20th and early 21st centuries, policymakers thought and wrote about how they might deploy pain, right, or the possibility of pain to deter undocumented border crossings, right? And this is remarkable. You have policymakers in Washington, D.C. talking about using physical pain to deter border crossings. So in the mid-1990s, policymakers launched Operation Gatekeeper and Operation Hold the Line, two immigration law enforcement campaigns that drove migrants to attempt border crossings through the Arizona-Sonora desert. In other words, policymakers hoped that the lethality of the desert, right, the deadly environment of the desert, would deter future migrant crossings. Subsequently, Customs and Border Protection developed a new approach to deterrence that they named the Consequence Delivery System. Through a combination of mass criminal prosecutions, mass detentions, and mass deportations, CBP sought to make border crossings so difficult and costly that migrants would not return. More recently, the Trump administration chose to separate children from their families, again with the express intent to cause enormous emotional pain. If returned to office, as David explained earlier, the Trump administration has promised to inflict even more suffering, rendering family separation the law of the land, launching mass deportations, and ending asylum as we know it. In their study of legal violence, Menjivar and Abrego explained that for migrants, legal violence pertains not only to the penalties stipulated by the law and the immigration enforcement practices of state officials, but instead, legal violence also refers to a broad and lasting set of harms, in their words, forms of social suffering set in motion by immigration laws and policies. And these are the forms of social suffering that Julia just referred to, the harms imposed not only on the immigrant in detention, in immigration detention, but also on his family, So in response to this state of affairs, right, to this pervasiveness of social suffering caused by our nation's immigration enforcement system, Menjivar and Abrego poignantly ask how a legal system that, quote, purports to protect the nation instead produces spaces and the possibility for material, emotional, and psychological injurious actions, unquote. So I'm going to end with this observation from Menjivar and Abrego, because their critique of the American legal system is more timely than ever before. At the same time that the upcoming election has been cast in some quarters as a fight for American democracy, a fight for our cherished rights and freedoms, policymakers, especially policymakers on the right, have proposed to dramatically expand the nation's immigration enforcement capacities. In so doing, they also will expand the chasm that's grown over the course of our nation's history between the experiences of citizens and non-citizens, whereby our nation's vaunted rights and freedoms belong to the privileged few, while suffering is the fate of the many migrants at our doors. Thank you.
Thanks so much to Debbie Kang and to all our great panelists. I want to remind everyone that if you have questions for our panel, please put them into the Q&A. We're going to have about 20 minutes to discuss some questions and answers. I'm going to lead with a question that for all panelists that, of course, you can take or leave as you wish. And then I'll turn to the Q&As from the audience. I want to be clear with the Q&As from the audience. I will prioritize those that I think speak most broadly to all our panelists today. But if I don't get to your question, or if I summarize your question in a way that you think takes away the meat of it, please feel free to send an email to our guests or to send an email to the IHRC, and we'll try to pursue your questions. Okay, so again, I'm going to start with a broad question for all our panelists, but don't feel like you have to chime in if you don't have anything you wish to add. As a number of you have pointed out, it does seem clear that we're facing an unprecedented level of misinformation or noise around immigration in this election season. So I have a two-part question for you. One, what resources would you recommend for voters to seek out accurate information about immigration in advance of the election? What do you consider to be trusted sources for updates on immigration policy, practices, immigrant experiences? And the second part of the question is, what is one misconception about immigration that you wish people or the media or voters would just get out of their heads, would let it go, would put aside permanently? So again, that's open to all of you. Please go in whatever order you wish, and please feel free to skip it if the question doesn't speak to you.
I'd just like to say that at the Cato Institute, we published a short booklet called 14 Common Arguments Against Immigration and Why They're Wrong, that goes through a lot of this stuff in a very succinct manner and provides, a number of citations that you can pursue as well for the different areas that you commonly hear about, everything from economics to influence on society and crime and those types of things. I think the most basic fallacy that kind of unites a lot of the problems that I see in the discourse around immigration is that we have adopted these standards when it comes to immigration and these modes of thinking about immigration that we would never apply to people in general or to our own population. And so when we think about immigrant workers coming here, the widespread perception is they make us poorer, they make they drag us down in some way. We don't think about Americans entering the labor force that way. And why don't we think about it that way? Because it's a good thing when we have more people contributing to our economy and contributing to others within their society. This is a major way in which Americans and people in general make the world a better place is by going out and working and producing goods and services for their fellow people. And that basic construct is lost when you get in this sort of contrived us versus them mentality, where it's a zero-sum game and we're all competing over a fixed pie. When the pie is not fixed, it is something that we all create through our labor. And when we have more people who come in and contribute to that pie, that's a good thing for us. And we should want more of that, whether it be from Americans or from immigrants. It shouldn't be looked as a negative thing. That's one example, but I think in general, my motto is that of economist Julian Simon. He called people the ultimate resource. We're the ones who create everything. That's the reason why we have an economy. It's the reason why we have anything. Look around your apartment right now or your house. You are going to see you didn't make any of this stuff. Other people made it for you. And that is the nature of a market economy, is we all work together to produce the great prosperity that we enjoy, and we want more people to do that for us. So
I'll just go in the order. I think so. I'm a historian. I believe so much so much of what Debbie talked about really resonated with me. But I guess the longer I've worked in policy advocacy, the less confidence I have that just telling people, refuting misinformation is going to convince some people. I usually turn to people like David and people like Aaron Melnick from the American Immigration Council, because he does a good job refuting the arguments of the misinformation that's put out there about crime, about like voting, that lots of illegal immigrants are voting, another huge myth that does not exist really. But I would say what I tend to do, my organization has done a lot of polling on this, and what we really work on storytelling, actually, because a lot of times telling the stories of people and what they actually go through, why they actually fled their country, why they actually came here, what they've actually experienced in ICE custody, what family separation meant to them. What we found is that whether or not you support refugee resettlement or support asylum varies tremendously if you know somebody, if you've met somebody and know somebody who've actually come in through that. And so we focus a lot on storytelling to try to really convey, rather than stats, which again, we do that too, but that's one of the things we really leaned into, and make refugees and asylum seekers their own storytellers. So we have this Refugee Storytellers Collective where people who've gone through it talk about what's happened to them. And we find that it's a very, very, very good communications tool, and getting sort of really hitting on the emotional response that a lot of people have to a lot of this misinformation. Because if it's a conspiratorial theory, it might not be able to be refuted by facts. I mean, if people aren't really thinking in terms of facts, again, just to put that out there, sort of like an emotional thing too. The other thing I would say is on misconceptions. I think Americans are, really see themselves as the center of the universe in the world. And they think that US policy controls everything, like border policy controls, how many people come to the border. Every policy change is going to mean that. What I have found interviewing people at the border is that many of them don't know actually about the new border restriction. They don't know they're not eligible for asylum. It's actually kind of shocking. Some do, but some don't. And they're asked questions. Why didn't you wait in Mexico until there was no proclamation? They're like, what proclamation? So to a certain extent, this idea that every single policy change that the US make is going to determine migration is a little bit misguided. It's important, but it's not controlling. And the other, a related misconception is that the U.S. is the most welcoming country and that we welcome more people per capita than anywhere else. And I'm telling you, from a refugee perspective, the vast majority of displaced people are living in third countries in the global south, in Africa, in Latin America. They're waiting there, and those people are hosting per capita way more displaced people than we ever would allow in through our asylum system, and even with these capacious parole pathways, which are making a dent, as we talked about. But still, I think those are some of the misconceptions, that the U.S. is the most generous in some ways, and at the same time that its policy is determining all kinds of things. And it gets also Debbie's point about deterrence and how effective it is. And to a certain extent, yes, of course, if you start shooting people across the border, they may not come in. But there's a lot of misconceptions about whether or not deterrence actually can completely work. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you. Julia or Debbie, do either of you want to weigh in with this?
I think just two misconceptions that I can maybe raise. One that I touched on during my presentation, which is that the sort of conflation between immigration law and criminal law, and sort of the lack of understanding that those are actually separate processes. And you can be forgiven for thinking that, because if you even go to an immigration court, people they're shackled, they're in orange jumpsuits in immigration court. It's set up like any other court that we know of, but the violations that people are being charged with are not, in fact, criminal violations. But you understand why observers could sort of come to that conclusion very easily. And the other one is, I think, just relates to what everybody has sort of been noting, is that this idea that even legal immigration is somehow easy or easy to access. And there are, barriers upon barriers, whether it's just access to legal services or, access to the documents that are needed, literacy, language, talk about rare languages for folks who are coming from Central America, all of these pieces that don't even get into the applications themselves, and making sure that those applications are properly filled out, where different administrations would reject an application if you didn't put the not applicable sign in the middle initial box. So just, and again, sort of the underlying theme of what I have been talking about, that these systems are incredibly complex. They are not easy to navigate, even for folks who are, have all the access. These are still difficult processes, and they can take years to get resolved.
Thank you.
So I would just add that for myself, when I'm seeking to deflect the misinformation that we get in the media, I actually look to the policy reports that all of you write. So thank you for all of that work. But then, and we were discussing this last week, I've been thinking more broadly about why immigration history repeats itself, why we keep repeating the same lies and falsehoods about immigrants and the border. And as I was mentioning to this group last week, my own thought right now is that we just don't teach immigration history enough. And year after year, I'm just struck by how the majority of my students know nothing about immigration history. They know what Ellis Island is, but they don't know what Angel Island is. They've never heard of Chinese exclusion. They never knew the Irish were discriminated against. And then in my work for these federal defenders throughout the country, we've been litigating the laws criminalizing undocumented immigration. I've discovered that the brilliant attorneys, whether they're prosecutors or the defenders and these highly educated judges, know nothing about immigration history. And so if we could somehow make immigration history, or more of it, a regular component of our K through 12 educations or college educations, And then I'm always urging history grad students and historians to speak at local bar associations. They actually love having immigration historians come and speak. Your local bar associations, or your local Rotary Club, your local library. To the greatest extent possible, go out and, if you know immigration history, go out and educate the general public.
Excellent, thank you. Those are great answers. So there were a couple questions in the Q&A that are focused on advocacy, which I really appreciate, particularly when we're thinking about politics, we're thinking about the election, we're thinking about these kind of top-down, big-level politics with a capital P going on, right? But of course, immigrants are organizing for themselves. Tens of millions of people are in mixed status families and mixed status communities that are advocating for immigrant rights. So these questions are asking, how can advocates shift the congressional consensus in a more pro-immigrant direction? Right? And also, how could advocates potentially shift an incoming Harris administration in a more pro-immigrant direction, particularly considering the point that Debbie has made and others have made, that xenophobia sometimes, often, historically, has won votes, right? So if there is a pressure on politicians towards a type of nativist viewpoint, how can we create a counter pressure on those politicians towards a pro-immigrant stance? How can we as advocates kind of push back against that xenophobia politically? And don't feel like you have to go in order, to anyone who wants to answer.
Okay, I'll try to be quick because I feel like I've answered long. The Democratic Party, I feel like, needs in the Senate, my approach has been to sort of really focus on more like affirmative legislation for the reception of people seeking asylum, sort of helping support cities who are receiving a lot of people. But in general, I think what needs to happen is we need to stop, like, the Democrats need to be convinced to stop pitting like people who've been here for a long time against the newcomers who they see as a bargaining chip for immigration reform. Like, that was what they did in 2013. And that's how we got into this like enforcement, the Democrats really leaning into enforcement, although it's longer than that, as Debbie pointed out. But in the current kind of cycle, the way it works, it's saying, well, like, can you legalize all these people who've been here for a long time, but we'll stop anybody else from being able to come in at the border. Like, that's basically been, we'll crack down on recent entries at the border. And I think we need to sort of like make it so that it's more like wholesome immigrant rights, like all immigrants together, one thing. And so there's a task force for new Americans that the Biden administration started and the Harris administration should actually do something with. And it's traditionally mostly focused on naturalization issues and people who've been here who are in legal status, but it should probably also focus on these reception issues, right, of newcomers that are coming in. Like, so if we can somehow get these groups together instead of pitted against each other in the Democrats, I think that's the way to steer the Senate. And I noticed Sarah Coleman's comment about how to I think the Biden administration has done different things than the Obama administration did on immigration, especially in the advent of these parole pathways that David was talking about. Like, it has leaned into the use of parole and making more pathways available, much more than the Obama administration did. And so I do think I could see Harris kind of doing even more of that. And I also think, Harris seems to be interested on things like housing policy, for example. We got to make sure that it's not just housing policy for Americans, it's housing policy also for immigrants. And, don't leave immigrants out of all the other policies that you're doing in the party. Like, they have to be part of the discussion of all the other types of policies they're doing, including housing, which is a huge problem for asylum seekers who come in and for refugees who are resettled, the lack of housing for people. So, okay, I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Any other panelists want to speak a little bit about advocacy?
Look, the only advocacy that I would say is you got to get the head of the Democratic Party to defend immigrants. I mean, if the head of the party can't say a nice word about immigrants, and that's been the case for the last 4 years. What's shocking about the poll numbers coming out showing that most Democrats are now skeptical of immigration? I mean, this is the root of the problem. I think it's a problem that the White House and the Biden administration and ultimately Harris created for themselves from day one by setting up this scenario that they're going to adopt all the standards of the prior administration. If border numbers are high, that means we're failing. And from that point on, it was impossible for them to say anything positive about the people who were coming. And so as long as that's the case, she can't defend immigrants on crime. She can't say that they're benefiting our communities and our economy, or any of the things that are true statements that respond to the criticisms being made by the other side. And so she's really tied her hands at this point. I hope there's some great reversal this week where she realizes, look, he's hammering me, and me saying, well, I tried to deport a lot of people is not a sufficient answer on this. And so maybe at some point, she'll realize that this isn't really working. No one's buying it. She's winning voters, certainly, but not on this issue. This isn't what's swaying people. She needs to come back and hit back. Like, people who are on the fence, okay, if both parties say we need restriction, then yeah, I'm going to adopt that position. But if she comes back and says, look, this has been a unexpected windfall, $1 trillion benefit to the fiscal situation in the United States, a great benefit to our economy, great benefit to our communities, that is a totally different departure from everything we've seen for the last 4 years. But it was actually the platform and the positions that Biden ran on and won in 2020. So I don't understand how we got in this position, other than, some advisors in the White House decided they had to go this direction. They have walked themselves into a corner, but I do see it not benefiting them. So hopefully someone gets through to them. I may not be the right messenger. I'm not part of the Democratic Party, but I don't get it. I think ultimately someone will come to their senses and say, look, this whole strategy of pandering to the median Trump voter is not going to win us an election. So hopefully that they'll change their mind on that. But that is the problem. I mean, that is the core issue and why we're in such a toxic environment, because there's no pushback. No one's being punished. Trump should be embarrassed. I mean, he's saying ludicrous things all the time, and yet there's no one out there hitting him on it.
Thank you. Yeah. Julia, Debbie, anything you want to add on that? Okay, well, I'm sorry to say that even though we have great other questions in the Q&A, we are a little bit over time. So we're going to have to wrap it up, but I do hope that that those of you who have asked these questions in the Q&A, please feel free to follow up, and we'll try to get your questions to the right places. Thank you so much to all 4 of our panelists. This has been a fascinating conversation, and I hope that we're surprised by the debate tonight, based on hope that both Trump and Harris were listening to our webinar today, and they come with a whole new attitude this evening. Thank you so much to our panelists and to everyone who's joined us today. I hope everyone has a wonderful afternoon.